This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the third Eavan McEnany Memorial Reading. This reading will be followed by a reception to which you are all invited next door at A.D. White. And for those of you who are young or who look young, please bring your ID with you. An interview with tonight's reader, Eavan Boland, will be available on the English website at www.artscornell.edu/English/creative. This sounds like we've just had a debate and people are raising money. If you can get to the English website, just click on the writer's blog. These interviews have been done all year by Professor John Lennon. Who, by the way, couldn't be here tonight because he and his wife had child care issues, but I wanted to thank him for a year's worth of blogs and mention that he has a new book coming out called The Castle. Because this is the last reading of the year in our series, I'd also like to thank Laurel Guy and Marianne Marsh, who've made everything happen. I should also add, though, there is an MFA reading coming up, a graduation reading, 1 week from Sunday at 2 p.m. over in Hollis E. Cornell, to which you are all invited, and there will also be a reception after that. Finally, I'd like to thank John Niederbuell, who has been selling books since last August when we had our first reading. He has done the heavy lifting. Literally, he's been up and down staircases and up and down hillsides, and he will be selling Eavan Boland's books tonight. We'll have a book signing immediately following, and he also has the book by Eavan McEnany available. This reading has been made possible by the friends and family of Eavan McEnany, some of who are here tonight, and in particular Bonnie McEnany, who is the widow of Eavan McEnany. And I wonder if the rest of you would join me in welcoming the entire McEnany group. Thank you. Tonight's introduction will be given by Kenneth A. McLean, who is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Literature. You'd think I'd know after several decades how to say professor. And who is also a Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow. He has done just about everything you can do in the way of work for the university. He has directed the program in creative writing. He has served twice as director of undergraduate studies in English. He has served on dean search committees. He has twice served on the presidential search committee, and I mean the search for the president of Cornell, not for our country, although we probably could have used his help at an indefinite time in the past. He has won a Clark Distinguished Teaching Award, and he has just done so many things that parts of Cornell would probably just drift away if Ken were not here to hold it on the ground. But his real achievement is that he is a poet, an essayist, a memoirist, and his work is exceptional. Of all of my distinguished colleagues in a very remarkable program in creative writing, Ken McLean is the one whose work first taught me, I think, that real writing is always a matter of life and death. That real writing can save a life. That's what he said about the writing of James Baldwin. It saved my life, he said. It can save the life of a writer, but also of the reader. But I don't want to make Ken sound like a grim person. He is one of the most passionate and joyful people I have ever met, who takes pleasure in jobs big and small, and one of his pleasures tonight is to introduce our reader tonight. Ken, thank you.
We're looking for a president? No. Thank you, Stephanie. It is a great delight to welcome you to the third Eavan McEnany Memorial Reading. I am particularly pleased that Bonnie McEnany, Eamon's wife, is still with us. is with us and still with us too, as well as Patrick McInerney, his brother, and many others who were his dear friends. And I'm also delighted that we have Eavan Boland, one of Ireland's greatest poets, which means, and as anyone who knows anything about literature knows, that we are in the presence of one of the world's great writers. This reading has particular importance for me. Far too often, we think of people as merely their achievements, almost as if we were engaged in compiling a police blotter. For example, my mother was Afro-American, she lived in Harlem, she painted, was brilliant, loved us. Yet she was also a million of other things, too numerous to mention, which is why we need writers to provide us a true calculus, a truer approximation of our meaning. Eavan McInerney was the father of 4 children, a wonderful husband, and a magnificent friend. He was a brilliant lacrosse player, one of the best to ever play the game, and he will be honored in a few days in Nassau Coliseum for his athletic prowess and for being the generous spirit he was. And though small in stature, he was a fierce football player too, who was even invited to try out for the New York Jets. But most importantly, and this his friends so admired, he was a poet and playwright, someone whose lyrics testified to a luminescent spirit and a bottomless fount of empathy, someone who loved Ireland and all things Irish. I was lucky to share a small part in the publication of his book of poems, A Bend in the Road, Cornell University Press, 2004, and there are copies there, and please buy them. You will be better for having them. A Bend in the Road is a book I termed big-hearted. From beautiful lyrics celebrating his wife Bonnie and his children, to pithy narratives about the dispossessed, these poems, like all great poems, sing. And as Bonnie McInerney's poignant introduction suggests, these poems can at times be disturbing. But disturbing only in that life disturbs, that a big, provident heart such as Eamon's took on the suffering of others as his, and could not lie about the disjunctures, the nullification, the ineludible fact that love, no matter how provident, can always save us, that life, sadly, is not always a respecter of dreams. Where Eavan saw hurt and injustice, it was a violation to him. And as he writes about the city as only those who understand it can, I know those cities, those subways, and I know why Eavan helped shepherd those 60 fellow workers down the smoke-filled corridors during the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, and why he would have lunch weekly with the homeless, not as an investment banker, but as a fellow traveler. I am in you, and you are in me. That's something that I used to hear in a black church all the time. Things happen to people, horrible things, and do count your blessings, and do please be generous. It is the greatest monument to someone that his life brings forward the best in others, which is at the center of this reading. I want to thank Tom Marino, Jack Gilbert, Don Little, Jonathan Levine, all of the classmates of Eamon's for endowing this series and for returning Eamon's generosity 100-fold. And the magnificent Richie Moran, a Cornell presence as large as his heart. And Bonnie and Kevin McInerney and all the others who have helped in this. And of course, and Patrick too, I'm losing my mind. And of course, our own Carol Sue Palmer. I want to thank them as I wish to thank Eavan McInerney for reminding us that the values of community and literature are eternal ones, and that Cornell is a place where friendship matters. Few of us, sadly, have ever been truly present at our lives. Eavan was, and his poems make us value those consummate verities: love, friendship, joy, kissing those who matter, and some who do not. I've kissed a lot of those myself. Maybe more than I would like to testify about. Given what I've said about Eavan, it is supremely fitting that we have Eavan Boland with us tonight. Professor Boland, who is the director of Stanford University's Creative Writing Program and vice chair, or should say assistant chair, I always like vice, but assistant chair of the English department, spends half of her year in Dublin. And her poems, published in 9 books, the most recent, New and Collected Poems, which just appeared about a month ago, remind us of why we so need poetry, how it, as Oscar Williams reminds, can even outweigh the atomic bomb. By the way, buy it. Buy it. Her poetry titles include Against Love Poetry, The Lost Land, An Origin Like Water, and Outside History. She has also co-edited 2 Norton anthologies, The Making of the Poem with Mark Strand, and The Making of the Sonnet with Edward Hirsch. And she is published in every literary magazine from the New Yorker to the Atlantic Monthly, and I could list others and others. She is also the recipient of the Lennon Foundation Award in Poetry and an American Ireland Fund Literary Award. Boland's poems are lyrical, tough-notioned, complex, and so ineludibly Irish, and by this I mean that they make us understand, if we ever doubted it, why someone can love a land which at times so bitterly confounds, and love it, and love it, and love it. When I was rereading Boland's magnificent In Time of Violence, beyond my utter amazement that a poem bound in the world could achieve such unbridled sonic lyricism, the ha-ha where even suffering can find song, I was just as evangelized by the sheer audacity of its unremitting humanness. These poems are about all manner of suffering and putting up, about the scourges of colonialism and sexism and class, and yet at the end of the lines for her 13th wedding anniversary, she writes, by the way, which is, I would argue, is one of the great poems about love and marriage. And if you are going to get married or whatever you're going to do, read it. But listen to the end of this. I mean, by the way, I would actually say that that whole love sequence will teach you more about what it means to be in the world, right? And you will learn to honor and cherish those things and cherish those people who in some sense meant so much to you in ways you often don't even understand. Listen to these lines. And this is just the end. And I hate to do this because you would do it so much better. It happened under our lives, the rain, the stone. We hardly noticed. Now this is the day to think of it, to wonder. All those years together, the stars in a frozen arc overhead, the quick noise of a thaw in the air, the blue stare of the hills. Through it all, this constancy, what wears, what endures. There is not a moment in her collected poems where wonder is diminished or squandered. When I first read Tolstoy, I couldn't explain how marvelous the death of Ivan Ilyich was. I was as speechless, as dumbfounded, as if I had just witnessed the birth of the firmament. Eavan Boland's poems leave me similarly awed. It is a supreme honor to introduce someone who, in every syllable, so honors us. It is a delight.
I just want to obviously begin by thanking Ken for such a gracious and kind introduction, and for his, his hospitality to me today. Thanks, Stephanie, for asking me to Cornell. And to just begin with a couple of remarks. I think poets are fortunate to read their work to audiences, and the Irish have a particular take on this. There's obviously differences between Irish poetry and American poetry, and they're very unquantifiable. But I certainly will say this for the Irish American people here today. I once judged a competition for the Irish Times on poetry. And the editor of the Irish Times came in at the reception, and he said, we on the newspaper, which has a close connection with Irish literature, have finally worked out what makes Irish poetry Irish poetry. He said, we have worked out that though only 10% of the Irish people read poetry, 45% of them write it. So, in some senses, Ken's very kind introduction makes me think of that. But although, there's that fortune in Ireland to come and read, and I'm fortunate to come and read here, there have been many readings any working poet gives. There will never be a reading I will be more honoured to give than the Eamon McEneaney reading. And, there's a nice phrase in Ireland, two friends shorten the road, which is just, the conversation. And I was lucky enough to hear a little of the conversation with Bonnie, Patrick, and the friends, and of course, Richie, at dinner to bring just a tiny moment of the grace and mark of this man who left such a witness, obviously, in language and in his life. I wanted to begin the reading with his poem, which is from A Bend in the Road. It's a beautiful poem, I thought. It's called Preface, and it's a perfect poem to start a reading and to start his book, which it does. Preface. My poems are written to be shared for myself and whoever may come to the road in which they lay. Take them as you may. I cannot tell you right from wrong, for these answers can only be found within. I cannot show you truth from the nonsensical thoughts that surround this world. No man has benefited by cheating another one. This I know myself to be true. In my poet's eyes, I see truth and try to live by its light. True brotherhood is only felt by the warmth this light brings to the heart. Eamon McEneaney's words, and I'm delighted to start. I'm going to just speak about a little bit. I think it's a difficult thing, when you look back at your own work, to say the things that have influenced you. But one of the things, I'm just going to begin with a very brief piece of prose, a short piece from a book I wrote, 10 years ago, which was at a moment when the thing I think that had influenced me most, which I'll explain in a minute, was present in my mind. And I wrote this book, and this is a very short piece of prose from it. In the early days of October, in the year 1909, a woman entered a Dublin hospital near the centre of the city of Dublin. And the building is still there. If you approach from the south with the Dublin hills behind you, and you look down a tunnel of grace made by the houses of Fitzwilliam and Marion Squares, your view will end abruptly in this: the National Maternity Hospital, red brick and out of character, blocking the vista. The rooms inside are functional and light eating, and they show no evidence of that zest for air and proportion, which was the mask of an Augustan oppressor. October is a beautiful month in the city of Dublin. If you turn round and you go back towards the hills, away from the hospital, the roads are narrow and gracious above the canal. And the woman who entered the hospital might have passed them as she made her way to it. If, for instance, she drove round Stephen's Green, having arrived on the late morning train from Drogheda, She might also have noticed a trick of light peculiar to that time of year in the city. In the dark corridor of Lower Leeson Street, sunlight cuts the houses in half. Halfway up the brick, the reflection of the houses opposite builds another street, chimneys and roofs and gutters made of unglittering shadow. She might not have come that way. She might have travelled down the unglamorous back streets that lead more directly to the hospital. Fenian Street and Hogan Place, past the mills and past the Dodder River on its way to the Liffey, up the slight gradient which would still in that year be cobbled. The pre-winter chill which could be felt on some October mornings could have struck extra music back then out of the horses' hooves. It isn't a long drive, but whatever she saw that morning is lost. Whatever that journey yielded, the child with a hoop who never existed and the woman with the red hat I am now inventing, they were her last glimpses of the outside world. And this is the way we make the past. This is the way I will make it here. Listening for hooves, glimpsing the red hat which was never there in the first place, giving eyesight and evidence to a woman I never knew and cannot now recover. And for all our violations, the past waits for us. The road from the train to the hospital opens out over and over again, vacant and glittering, and again I visited and reinvented. But the woman who actually traveled it had no such freedom. Hers was a real journey, and she never came back. On October the 10th, 1909, she died in the National Maternity Hospital. She was 31 years of age, and she was my grandmother. Now, the reason I began with just that very brief piece was to say that of all the things that influenced me as a poet, it wasn't the reading of other poets, and it wasn't any kind of a revelation. It was a slow realization that in a small country like Ireland, there is really a huge difference between the past and history. Irish history, when I was young, seemed to be a powerful story that had come from this small country, which had overcome powerful neighbor and had made its path in the world and had become a state. But when you looked at that history closely, it really was a story of heroes. And nothing really troubled me more than that, because the country that in some way I understood was really not a country of heroes, and the story was not a story of heroes. And I began to think, well, there's something else, and that something else, of course, was the past. And the past, which was a place of whispers and silences, of everybody's background, of nothing glamorous, of nothing that could be put into any kind of heroic story. And this poem was written at a time when I was most struck by that, this huge wide gap, and it's called Quarantine. It's a poem that comes from a few sentences in a book that was published in 1900 in Ireland. The book was called Mushkel Féin, just my own story, by a man called Untitled Chapter, a priest. And he wanted to go back to the famine, the Irish famine, and talk about when he had been a very young boy and the things he'd heard and seen. And he really just puts in these couple of sentences about 1847, when the potato famine was sweeping through the country, when there was a tremendous amount of famine and fever. Describes a young couple who left one night this terrible workhouse, and they walked back and they walked past the places they had known, and they went to the cabin where they had been young together as a wife and husband. And in the morning, it was a bitter night, they were found dead. But in that little piece of prose, there's a half sentence. They were just found dead, but he had her feet held against his chest. He was trying to warm her feet as she died. So for those three sentences, those people come out of a past, and then they are gone. And they are gone into an absolutely complete silence. They have no history. They have no narrative. And I wrote this poem, Quarantine, deliberately as some kind of a rebuke to the literature we write, which gathers in so many of the glamours of the narrative and leaves so many of these stories untold. Quarantine. In the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking, they were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved. So that poem brought me to another place, of course, which is, again, that thing which a lot of poets will write about, the idea of memory and how we think about memory. And this is a poem called That the Science of Cartography is Limited. And it's about, one of the same things that happened in the 1847 famine. The relief committees came over to Ireland when Ireland was in the second year of the famine. People were starving, and they didn't have any strength. And the relief committees from England were willing to give food to these people, provided they worked for it. And the people, of course, had no strength to work. They couldn't build. They couldn't do anything. Most of them were suffering from this terrible famine fever. And if you go into the woods, especially in Mayo and especially in Meath, which are the two counties where this happened, you will look down and see these tiny roads that disappear into nowhere because the people who were building them died building them. And they are really the terrible scar tissue of Irish history, but they don't really show up on any map of any kind. And I wanted to question that. This is the poem. That the science of cartography is limited, and not simply by the fact that this shading of forest cannot show the fragrance of balsam, the gloom of cypresses, is what I wish to prove. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of Connacht and entered a wood there. Look down, you said, this was once a famine road. I looked down at ivy and the Scotch grass rough cast stone had disappeared into. As you told me in the second winter of their ordeal, in 1847, when the crop had failed twice, relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. Where they died, there the road ended and ends still. And when I take down the map of this island, it is never so. I can say here is the masterful, the apt rendering of the spherical as flat, nor an ingenious design which persuades a curve into a plane, but to tell myself again that the line which says woodland and cries hunger and gives out among sweet pine and cypress and finds no horizon will not be there. Now those questions, which were questions for myself, also came down to my own very personal life. And one of the poems here gathered together for me those questions about memory and history and why we would write a poem at all and who gets left out of a poem, who gets put into a poem. This is a poem for my husband. It goes back to a dark time in our lives, and it's just called Love. And We went out many years ago when our children were extremely small. They were both under the age of 3. We went out to this wonderful Iowa Writers International program. And we were in this Midwestern town, which seemed sort of wonderful to us. And then the smaller child really fell desperately ill, and we truly thought she would die. She was 11 months old, and she got meningitis, and she made a truly great recovery, and is in the debt of American medicine. But for those days, you know, her life was certainly in doubt. And I particularly remembered one afternoon, meeting Kevin, my husband, on the bridge in the snow, very far away from our own landscape, very far away from our own country, you know, when we truly thought this child wouldn't live, and that stayed with me. But, you know, when I went back years later to read for the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and, you know, I stopped at the bridge, and it wasn't winter any longer, you know, it was in fact autumn. And, you know, I could see Kevin there as clear, of course, as clear, and I could replace the autumn with the snow. But, you know, that was only memory and the ghosts of memory. And, you know, this poem is partly built on the great book of Virgil's Aeneid, which is the book of the underworld, where Aeneas goes down to hell. And he goes there, and his old friends and adversaries come up and shout at him, but the words turn into nothing. They're just whispers, because it's the underworld. And I sometimes wonder if that isn't just memory. And this is called love. Dark falls on this Midwestern town, where we once lived when myths collided. Dusk has hidden the bridge in the river, which slides and deepens to become the water the hero crossed on his way to hell. Not far from here is our old apartment. We had a kitchen and an Amish table. We had a view. And we discovered there love had the feather and muscle of wings and had come to live with us, a brother of fire and air. We had 2 infant children, one of whom was touched by death in this town and spared. And when the hero was hailed by his comrades in hell, their mouths opened and their voices failed, and there is no knowing what they would have asked about a life they had shared and lost. I am your wife, and it was years ago. Our child is healed. We love each other still. Across our day-to-day and ordinary distances, we speak plainly, we hear each other clearly. And yet I want to return to you on the bridge of the Iowa River as you were, with snow on the shoulders of your coat and a car passing with its headlights on. And I see you as a hero in a text, the image blazing and the edges gilded. And I long to cry out the epic question, my dear companion, will we ever live so intensely again? Will love come to us again and be so formidable at rest, it offered us ascension even to look at him? But the words are shadows, and you cannot hear me. You walk away, and I cannot follow. Now, I work at Stanford University, which has indeed many associations with Cornell, with Michael and Stephanie, of course, and you know, I came later into a program that really has a glittering history. So it ought to be my favorite job ever, because you know, I get to teach young poets, and I get to be in this wonderful environment, and it's my co-favorite job ever, but it's not. There is one other, and I'll explain that. You know, Ireland has all kinds of different situations and all kinds of different ways in which it settles up its poets. And one of these was in 1994, when the National Maternity Hospital that I mentioned in that piece of prose asked me to be their poet in residence for the year. And it was a very Irish job. It had no job description of sort of any kind, and nobody said what you were to do. And in fact, that hospital, which you can't miss in the city of Dublin, is the hospital of James Joyce's Ulysses. It is the hospital of the Oxen of the Sun chapter, which the hospital never mentions, because I have a very unflattering chapter about it. But anyway, so certainly James Joyce wasn't part of their centenary. But, I was very fond of them. And as I said, people would come up to me in the city and they were very interested in what I was doing at the hospital. And people would say to me, are you doing anything with the new mothers and the new babies? I never went near the new mothers and the new babies for one reason, which was that my own children were born in the National Maternity Hospital, and just exactly the last thing I would have liked to have seen when they were born was the poet in residence. So, but I did write one poem there, and I have remained connected to it, and it's a poem called The Pomegranate, and they, I remain very fond of them, and I often think of them. And this is a poem called The Pomegranate. It's about nothing more surprising than having a child who turns into a teenager, something that I'm sure many people share here. But in fact, it is it's built on this beautiful old myth of Ceres, whose child is kidnapped and is taken down to the hell of the underworld, and she goes down to plead for the child to come back, gets her back for just 6 months of the year, which it's really the myth of the seasons, gets her back for the summer and the spring, but the child has to stay. But the child could have come home completely. They hadn't eaten anything, but the child eats a pomegranate, the pomegranate. The only legend I have ever loved is the story of a daughter lost in hell and found and rescued there. Love and blackmail are the gist of it. Ceres and Persephone, the names. And the best thing about the legend is I can enter it anywhere and have. As a child in exile in a city of fogs and strange consonants, I read it first. And at first, I was an exiled child in the crackling dusk of the underworld, the stars blighted. Later, I walked out in a summer twilight, searching for my own daughter at bedtime. When she came running, I was ready to make any bargain to keep her. I carried her back past white beams and wasps and honey-scented buddleias, but I was Ceres then, and I knew winter was in store for every leaf on every tree on that road was inescapable for each one we passed, and for me. It is winter, and the stars are hidden. I climb the stairs and stand where I can see my child asleep beside her teen magazines, her can of Coke, her plate of uncut fruit, the pomegranate. How did I forget it? She could have come home and been safe and ended the story and all our heartbroken searching. But she reached out a hand and plucked a pomegranate. She put out her hand and pulled down the French sound for apple and the noise of stone and the proof that even in the place of death, at the heart of legend, in the midst of rocks full of unshed tears, ready to be diamonds by the time the story was told, a child can be hungry. I could warn her, there is still a chance. The rain is cold, the road is flint-colored, the suburb has cars and cable television, the veiled stars are above ground. It is another world. But what else can a mother give her daughter but such beautiful rifts in time? If I defer the grief, I will diminish the gift. The legend will be hers as well as mine. She will enter it as I have. She will wake up. She will hold the papery flush skin in her hand and to her lips, and I will say nothing. Now, I have given you the sort of more serious side of the idea of memory. But there are people in Ireland. The book I wrote, Object Lessons, is dedicated to my mother, who really was my great hero. and I dedicate it to my mother, who was really the friend of my lifetime. My mother had absolutely no interest in the past, no interest in memory, and didn't want to discuss these things with me. And when my children were small, I would go down, she lived very near us, and I would say to her, she was orphaned, her mother had died in a fever ward, as in that her father drowned in the Bay of Biscay. And I used to say to her, you know, there must be something from your childhood, you know, because we had 2 little girls and I wanted them. She had no interest whatsoever. She never spoke about it. She thought it was ridiculous to, you know, pursue all that stuff, and she just put it aside. But one evening, I went down there, and like a sort of door that springs open in a wall, she told me a story. And the story was so bizarre that I was just stunned. And the story was about her grandfather, my great-grandfather. And I said to her at once, is that true? And she said, I don't know. So here comes the story with the warning. And, you know, but I was possessed by the story and put it in the book. And probably I think this is what happens when memory deserts history, or history deserts the past, or something. This is what you get. Anyway, my grandmother came. This is the prose piece. My grandmother came from a family of millers sometime after the famine. They left the small fishing town of Milford in Donegal on the west coast. And hard-pressed as they were, they must have missed the idiosyncrasy of their own place. The sight of Mulroy Bay in February light and the main street with its steep climb up the side of a hill. They moved east and south as a family to the town of Dundalk, and there the small business of baking they had failed, and they moved again to Leitrim, the harsh county where her father was born. And it was to him that legend clung, and the way I built the legend now is the way I heard it from my mother, out of rumor and fossil fact and half memory. Her grandfather, my great-grandfather, was apparently a small man, compact and saturnine in the way of many Western Irish people. If he was anything like his son, who I met for a few hours many years ago, he had eloquent and strained features, and he had a fine profile, and close-set and obstinate eyes, and something strained and pinched about it all, which kept it well away from beauty. He grew up in Leitrim, and sometime in his early manhood, I imagine the early 1870s, he fell in love with a local girl. I know so little about her or about him that I have to become the fictional interventionist here and say she was, of course, winning and expressive and true to him, and that he loved her stubbornly. But there was an obstacle. She was a younger sister, and in the manner of all the fairy tales, her older sister was plain and deserving, and on no account to be slighted by having the younger girl marry first, which was a closely held rural custom. So it went around. The parents insisted he must offer his suit to the older sister. They might have offered him inducements, but I doubt it. The inducement could only have been local custom and iron decorum. There were no dowries. These were poor people, reduced in circumstance by a difficult century, utterly vulnerable to the sickness of a heifer or a farthing's change in the price of wheat. They would have brought to bear on him the influence of local opinion and approval. He must marry the older girl, and that was that. And he was implacable. It would be the younger one, that was all. The younger girl retained her love for him, and he for her, and finally, now the story quickens, gets unsteady, and fills up with unknown passages of time and event. The impasse yielded, love triumphed, and the wedding day was set. I have no document, and I have no wedding certificate. I have my grandmother's marriage certificate, but not this one. In any case, the cold signatures of the witnesses and the sacristan could do no justice to the event. The wedding day came, and it seems safe to imagine a small granite church in the middle of a townland, and the weather, more than likely, grey and overcast. Perhaps the turned out a bit more than usual because of the notoriety of the whole thing, the struggle of wills, and all the gossip and curiosity incurred on that account. The bride came, dressed in white, heavily veiled. The vows were taken and repeated and said by the bride and the groom, and the priest pronounced them man and wife. For a single moment, it must have seemed to him that some wound of ill luck and misadventure in his own life had undergone a miraculous healing. Then he lifted her veil. It was not the face he loved. Convention had prevailed. The family had smuggled in the older, plainer girl, and he was bound to her by iron convention and legality for the rest of his life. But they had 13 children, so nothing wrong with the story. As I said, my mother was my great hero. This is a poem which is called An Elegy for My Mother, in which she scarcely appears. And she died at a great age. And she had a great love for all those things which really are the disappearing ecology of life. She loved kitchens. She loved all the wooden spoons and the pots and pans, the things you suddenly turn around and you see are gone. One day I sort of looked around a kitchen and I simply could not see a single thing in it that my mother had once loved. And I thought, why is it that we make an ecology and environmentalism of so many other things? But those things we loved and we grew up with and we cared about, we don't. I knew we had to grieve for the animals a long time ago, weep for them and pity them. I knew it was our strange human duty to write their elegies after we arranged their demise. I was young then and able for the paradox. I am older now and ready with the question. What happened to them all? I mean to those old dumb implements which have no eyes to plead with us like theirs, no claim to make on us like theirs. I mean there was a singing kettle. I want to know why no one tagged its neck or ringed the tin base of its extinct design, or crouched to hear its rising shriek in winter, or wrote it down with the birds in their blue sleeves of air, torn away with the trees that sheltered them. And there were brass fire dogs, which lay out all evening on the grate and in the heat thrown at them by the last of the peat fire. But no one noted down their history, or put them in the old packs under slate blue moonlight. There was a wooden clothes horse, absolutely steady, without sinews, with no mane, and no meadows to canter in, carrying, instead of landlords or Irish monks, rinsed tea cloths, but still I would have thought worth adding to the catalogue of what we need, what we always need, as is my mother, on this Dublin evening of fog crystals and frost, as she reaches out to test one corner of a cloth for dryness, as the pre-war Irish twilight closes in and down on the room, and the curtains are drawn. And here am I, not even born, and already a conservationist, with nothing to assist me but the last and most fabulous of beasts, language, which knows as I do that it's too late to record the loss of these things, but does so anyway and anxiously in case it shares their fate. This is a poem which was a title poem of a recent book, and it's called Domestic Violence. And despite its dark title, it refers to something different, which was the domestic lives we lived through a time of violence in Ireland in the 70s. The time when we would come down in the morning into the houses and the rooms and the kitchens of our lives, while, the radio spoke of these terrible deaths and how we tried to shelter our own spirits and persuade ourselves that that violence had nothing to do with us. We look back now, and I look back now, and it is a world full of questions for me. Domestic violence. It was winter, lunar, wet. At dusk, pewter seedlings became moonlight orphans. Pleased to meet you, meet to please you, said the butcher's sign in the window in the village. Everything changed the year that we got married. And after that, we moved out to the suburbs. How young we were, how ignorant, how ready to think the only history was our own. And there was a couple who quarreled into the night, their voices high and sharp. Nothing is ever entirely right in the lives of those who love each other. And in that season, suddenly, our island broke out its old sores for all to see. We saw them too. We stood there wondering how the salt horizons and the Dublin hills, the rivers, Table Mountains, Viking marshes we thought we knew had been made to shiver into our ancient 12 by 15 television, which gave them back as grey and greyer tears and killings, 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 then moonlight-coloured funerals. And nothing we said, not then, not later, fathomed what it is wrong in the lives of those who hate each other. And if the provenance of memory is only that, remember, not atone, and if I can be safe in the weak spring light in that kitchen, then why is there another kitchen? Spring light always darkening in it, and a woman whispering to a man over and over, what else could we have done? We failed our moment, or our moment failed us. The times were grand in size, and we were small. Why do I write that when I don't believe it? We lived our lives, were happy, stayed as one. Children were born and raised here and are gone, including ours. As for that couple, did we ever find out who they were, and did we want to? I think we know. I think we always knew. I want to finish with a poem for the McEnany family, and the poem is called The Emigrant Irish. And, in hearing the conversation, which was really wonderful at dinner this evening, I thought of the old conversations we had in Ireland about those who stayed and those who left, and how in many ways that's always a tormented conversation. Every country that has a great emigration fears that the best and the strongest and the brightest are gone from it, but tries to persuade themselves that that isn't true. And, the old and very loving traffic between the United States of America and Ireland always struck me. And I lived some of my childhood in New York and some in England, and my mother would always show me the wharves where the Irish came in. And yet there was a certain moment when it was plain in Ireland that we wanted to forget them. We wanted to turn ourselves into some kind of a modern state and persuade ourselves that none of that suffering and survival and endurance ever happened. And my husband's mother was a wonderful woman. She came from the west of Ireland, and I think I must have been saying these things to her. And she said, when electrification, when the electric light came west of the Shannon, and people finally got electric light, they took all those beautiful oil lamps and threw them out. And the remark just stayed with me, and I thought, how could we forget? It's for the McEnany family, for Richie, for the Irish who came to these shores, and for all that they brought of Ireland and all they gave back, the emigrant Irish. Like oil lamps, we put them out the back of our houses, of our minds. We had lights better than and newer than, and then a time came, this time, and now we need them. Their dread makeshift example. They would have thrived on our necessities. What they survived, we could not even live. By their lights now, it is time to imagine how they stood there, what they stood with, that their possessions may become our power. Cardboard, iron, their hardships parceled in them, patience, fortitude, long-suffering in the bruise-colored dusk of the new world, and all the old songs, and nothing to lose. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There'll be a short book signing here in the auditorium before Eavan goes to A.D. White. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for a magnificent reading. Thank you.